Okay, hello and welcome to everyone. I am Mara Benadusi. I am professor of anthropology at the University of Catania, and I am current president of the Italian Society for Applied Anthropology. Before starting, we please ask you to mute your microphones and also to turn your videos off if you can, otherwise that worsens the quality of Zoom connection. Let's also recall that this meeting is being recorded and the video will be available on our YouTube page and website as soon as possible in a couple of days. I want to begin to say good afternoon, good evening, and good morning for wherever you are in the world. Welcome you to our second speaker's corner titled Unprepared Global Health in Times of Emergency, that is sponsored by the Italian Society for Applied Anthropology in cooperation with the Department of Political and Social Sciences at the University of Catania in Sicily. Before getting started, just a brief explanation about these webinars. The idea behind them is to open a space for listening, speaking up, and sharing reflections in time of emergency, in times that force all of us to experience this extraordinary state that limits our mobility and produces anxiety and suffering in families, in groups, and in the society at large. And this is also an uncertain time that generates shifting reflections and even unexpected opportunities for learning, sharing opinions, moving action from below. It's really a very fluid situation with political, economic, and health conditions changing rapidly, both locally and globally. As researchers, thus, and engaged citizens, we are all forced to adjust to rapid changes that affect our own societies and affects also the fields we work in as well. This means that we have to use our knowledge and our common sense or anthropological imagination to make sense of this breakdown and to carefully unpack its controversial developments. And this is why, as members of the Italian Society for Applied Anthropology and researchers at the Department of Political and Social Sciences at the University of Catania, we say, okay, now we all have this new common guest at the table, the COVID-19, with all its corollary social disruption, uneven political effects, unsolved question marks, and non-stop changing restrictions. So why don't we feed all these with public debates that are good to share with others? Why don't we engage in open conversations and informal talks to make our thoughts and potential for action go further? And why don't we do this by inviting committed and aware interlocutors that can provide tools to shed the better light on the current? Indeed, we believe that anthropology can help us to cultivate a positive readiness to both listening to others and question ourselves. And it is precisely with this intent that we have opened this online Speakers Corner. In its classical version at Hyde Park, as you know, in London, the Speakers Corner started as an area of open-air discussion about topics of public interest. By revisiting this tradition, on the one hand, we wanted to give emphasis to fundamental rights, the right of life, well-being, work, education, to reliable information, the right to speak and to express reasoned alternative opinions. And on the other hand, as anthropologists, we wanted to confirm our duty to listen to the current situation, to the pandemic, to these uncertain times, listen to other voices and forms of knowledge. So thanks to everybody to be here, and thanks very much to Andrew Lakoff, who accepted to be our speaker today. I'm really delighted to introduce to you Andrew, who holds a joint appointment in the Department of Sociology and Communication at the University of Southern California. He was trained as anthropologist of science and medicine, and has carried out research in Argentina, France, and the United States. His current research concerns the articulation of expertise in public health and security in a global context. In his latter book, Unprepared, Global Health in a Time of Emergency, Andrew analyzes the recent upsurge in global health emergencies, from SARS to Ebola to Zika. The book follows the history of health preparedness from its beginnings in 1950s Cold War civil defense to the early 21st century, and describes how international health authorities, government officials, and vaccine manufacturers carved out a global space for governing potential outbreaks. And yet, despite all these efforts, Andrew explains how the project of global health security continues to be unsettled by the prospect of surprise, as the current coronavirus pandemic clearly demonstrates. And this is precisely the issues that the webinar will address. Before starting, I am honored to leave the floor to our rector, the rector of the University of Catania, Professor Francesco Priolo, that is in the room for a greeting. Francesco, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mara. Actually, it's really a pleasure as a rector of the University of Catania that this webinar is organized by Mara Benadusi from our university, and that all of you will have the possibility to listen to one of the most important people in the world, Andrew Lakoff of the University of Southern California. Let me say that this is a very difficult time. It's a very difficult time worldwide. It's a very difficult time here in Italy and in a large part of Europe, in the United States. And actually, this pandemic situation is something we never would have expected to leave in our life. And actually, we never wanted to leave. And in fact, we are here. And let me say that in a period in which we need to have distancing among ourselves to be safe, actually technology is really helping us to be connected all over the world, to be connected among ourselves. And for instance, I mean, all of our university and University of Catania as well have organized in just a few weeks all the didactic plans, all online, just to maintain the whole community connected. I mean, just think what would have been the effect of such a pandemic case just 10 years ago. No more than 10 years ago. I think all the community would have remained just disconnected. But internet and the ability to be connected helped us really in continue to have culture between ourselves, continue to actually interact. And therefore, it's particularly important to maintain this distancing and be safe and try to actually succeed in eliminating this pandemic event as soon as possible. Of course, my first thought goes to all of those who have been infected by the virus, and all of those who are no more with us, and all of those who in fact made it and now are out of it, and all of those who are struggling against it. So I think that really our community that will never be the same, as you will tell us, will never be the same after this event, because an event such as this will certainly change the society profoundly. We have to struggle, we have to look at the future really with the best wishes, and all of us are here just to really understand what the future will be and how we can learn from this event, and we can really maintain a better future. So thanks for all of you to being with us. Thanks to Mara, thanks to our speaker today, and I will follow, as all of you, what he has to tell us. Thanks, and a good webinar.
Thank you to Professor Priolo. One more thing before starting, if you have any question for the speaker, please send a message to Lorenzo Dorsey through the private chat box. Lorenzo is one of the organizers of these webinars. And this is our team. I am Mara Benaduzzi, as I told you. Lorenzo Dorsey, Luca Rimoldi, and Irene Falconieri are the other organizers. We all work, or have been working as anthropologists at the Department of Political and Social Sciences at the University of Catania. And today, Lorenzo Dorsey will collect your request to speak to make the conversation easier. He will regulate the terms for speaking after Andrew's talk. All right, I don't want to take up too much time, just a single input before leaving to Andrew the floor. Andrew, in your recent book, you explain the controversial nature of the criteria that a given situation must meet to be considered an official global health emergency. It must constitute a health risk to other countries through international spread. It must require a coordinated response because it is unexpected, serious, or unusual, and it must have global implications that require immediate action. However, you also argue that this list of criteria does not quite address the question that had been posed. What exactly makes a situation an emergency? If we turn this question to the current pandemic, what are the criteria that forge this crisis as a public health emergency for the globe? In your view, what are the medical, political, economic, even cultural variables that make the COVID-19 a global emergency? How does this pandemic differ from the health emergency you have dealt with in the past? What continuities and changes do you recognize between previous epidemics, such as Ebola or Zika, and the current coronavirus? Andrew, our speaker's corners is yours. Thank you.
Well, before answering your question, I would like to first of all thank you, Mara, for the invitation, and thank you to your team for organizing this series. I also want to acknowledge the rector and his remarks on the importance of community and scholarly reflection in these very difficult times around the world. I'm especially grateful to be able to participate from Los Angeles in this open air discussion. It's the morning here. Typically, I was telling Mara earlier, at this time of year, my family is getting ready to travel to Europe. And so I'm especially sad that I don't get to visit my colleagues and friends there in person this year. But I am happy that we can meet at least in this way. And I particularly appreciate the goal of this series to contribute to a better understanding of the contradictory pressures that the pandemic exposes us all to. I've been myself reflecting on what the role of a critical observer, a reflective anthropologist, is in the midst of this kind of event. I, as most of you, are used to having some time to step back and reflect on our observations before making large or even modest claims about them. And I still feel that way in this case. That is, we're in the midst or even at the beginning of an event whose contours we still don't completely understand. And so the question arises of what we as scholars can and should say about it and to each other at this time. My own reflections have been helped by an observation by a writer I admire named Masha Gessen, who recently remarked that historians of the future, when they look back at this moment, will rely on the detailed observations that were made by people who lived through it. If we don't actually observe carefully and note what's unfolding around us right now, there won't be records of it in the future to look back on and to comprehend what's happened. I think that signals something for us as anthropologists and our task, that is to be very thoughtful and use reflective and our own well-honed analytic tools to carefully observe what we're seeing or what we're reading, what we're hearing. I think with that, I want to make a sort of tell you what I'll discuss, and I want to be fairly brief and leave a lot of time for discussion. My idea is that perhaps the book that I wrote, in conversation with other anthropologists working on anticipation, like Mara, provide some analytical tools that might help us in figuring out what we should be looking at and thinking about today. My own tools come from a field that I would call historical ontology, founded by Michel Foucault, pushed forward by scholars like Ian Hacking and Paul Rabineau, which really asks the question of how certain kinds of abstract entities that we tend to take for granted, the economy, society, the psyche, are in fact brought into being through the practices often of experts, through knowledge practices, through techniques of governmental intervention. How do those taken for granted entities emerge, and what are their effects once they have been made real, as it were, on us? And my book, which Mara described, Unprepared, poses this question about the figure of the global health emergency. The title, I think, sometimes, at least in the United States, will give journalists or others the wrong impression that my role as a thinker is to warn people that we are not prepared enough. We should be more prepared. And in fact, and sometimes I'm even asked today, why weren't we better prepared for this event? And I should say that the book is not a book of forecasting. It's not a prescient book. It's not a book that anticipates the possibility of an event like coronavirus. It was published 2 years ago, but it's really a history of the present of 2 years ago. And it asks, it's not a book of anticipation, but rather it's a book about anticipation. It asks how have experts and health authorities come to constitute infectious disease outbreaks as events of a certain kind that pose the problem of emergency, which is a problem of both expertise and politics. So by the term unprepared, I don't mean that we were once well prepared and are now less so, or that we've been preparing for the wrong things exactly, but rather to ask the question, how did a norm of preparedness, and I think this is particularly a story in the United States, but the one that has expanded globally over the last couple of decades, how did this norm come to structure thought and action about the problem of infectious disease? So the book is a study of the forms of rationality through which experts have come to know and potentially intervene in an uncertain future. It tells the story of the emergence and consolidation of an apparatus for managing global health threats, beginning really in the late 1980s and continuing through the first decade and a half of the 21st century. What I want to do here is very briefly summarize some of the key points of this story, really in about hopefully 10 or 15 minutes, make a few observations about the present discussion of coronavirus in this context of global health emergencies, and then open up the floor to conversation, which is what I really look forward to. So the book, although it locates the emergence of the field of global health emergency preparedness in the last 2 decades or so, the book itself begins several decades before that in the United States during the Cold War. And it makes the argument that the norm of preparedness and the forms of expertise that go along with it arose out of anticipation of a very different kind of event, not the outbreak of an infectious disease, but rather a nuclear attack by the Soviet Union on the United States. Military planners during the early Cold War, coming out of the world of defense mobilization, that is industrial preparedness for a total war, decided or realized that the event of a nuclear attack was unprecedented, and there was really no way to plan for it based on knowledge of the past. One really needed to develop imaginative practices to be ready to be ready for such an attack and to survive it and recover in order to win a future war. And so these planners, over the course of the 1950s and 1960s, invented a whole series of techniques and knowledge practices that would later be transposed into other domains, from nuclear attack to natural disasters, to environmental accidents, to terrorist attacks, to pandemics eventually. And some of the techniques that I describe in the book include computer-based simulations, models of the effects that an attack would have on the vital infrastructures on which the population depends, scenario-based exercises and drills in which planners and even the public were brought together to enact an imaginary version of the event, and in order to generate knowledge about what kinds of vulnerabilities we have in the present to that event and try to mitigate those vulnerabilities. Measures were developed to ensure governmental continuity, to lay out essential actions that would have to be performed in the event of such an attack. Stockpiles were developed, not only stockpiles of critical materials, but also supplies that would be essential to population survival. Some of the discussions we see today around the medical stockpile in the United States, the question of how many masks and ventilators and biomedical countermeasures we have available and how those could be distributed to the population in the event of an outbreak. Those very tools were really invented in the 1950s in the context of the anticipation of nuclear war. And one of the suggestions I want to make by describing this process of transposition of techniques from one domain to another is to suggest those vulnerabilities. Measures were developed to ensure governmental continuity. Sorry, something's funny happening with my sound. I'm hearing an echo now. Okay, it's gone away. So those measures have may have certain constraints in their capacity to deal with very different kinds of events, but those are the sorts of devices and instruments that were developed as part of preparedness. More generally, we can say that preparedness is a practice for generating knowledge about current vulnerabilities in relation to uncertain future catastrophic events. And it does so by imaginatively enacting those events through simulations and scenarios. And one of the major contrasts that I make in the book is between this way of anticipating the future, that is through imaginative enactment of how an event might unfold, and other ways that in modernity collectives have sought to manage possible threats. One of the most prominent of those we can associate with insurance, with actuarial rationality, which assumes that the future will look somewhat like the past. That is, you have an archive of historical occurrence of certain kinds of incidents, we might say of disease or of accidents. And so we can actually decide, we can do a cost-benefit analysis of the benefits, the value of certain measures to intervene or to decrease the likelihood of a given event occurring. Preparedness works on a very different type of an event that either has not occurred in the past or has occurred so rarely that we don't know how likely it is or what its outcome might be. The example of a global devastating pandemic is a good one. The last time we had this was perhaps 1918 with the Spanish influenza, although we might say that the flu pandemics of the 50s and 60s were somewhat similar as well. But these kinds of events are not amenable to forms of technical risk assessment, but they also may not be preventable. And so another style of reasoning for thinking about future hazards, which is the precautionary principle, may not help in this case too, because the onslaught of the event may not be preventable. Preparedness as a governmental rationality, we can say that it's biopolitical in that it is oriented toward sustaining the welfare of the population. But this is what I would call a reflexive form of biopolitics, in that it's attuned to the vulnerabilities of the systems, the infrastructures, transportation, energy, communication, food and water, the various systems that have been built up over the last 2 centuries, at least, to sustain populations are now vulnerable to disruption. And it's those vulnerabilities that the rationality of preparedness is most focused on trying to mitigate. Let me say a few words about how this schema for anticipating future threats came over the decades to move from the world of nuclear attacks into the world of possible global pandemics. And there are at least two key strands to this story. One of them comes out of the world of infectious disease epidemiology, and microbiology, beginning in the late 1980s and early 1990s, in the wake of AIDS, in the wake of the emergence of other previously unknown diseases, such as Ebola in the 1970s. What had seemed to be a decline in the problem of infectious disease, a seeming triumph over the microbe, was undermined by the emergence of these new diseases. And a number of experts said that AIDS was a harbinger of things to come, that we could anticipate a world in which newly emerging viruses would continue to arrive and could inflict catastrophic damage on the population. And they argued that this vulnerability was the result of changing relations between humans and the natural world, increasing incursions into new ecological spaces, increasingly concentrated urban populations, civil conflict, the possibility of rapid global transportation. All of these relatively recent developments had made the global population increasingly threatened by new viruses. Now, separately from that, and in parallel, and here we move sort of away from the global space of infectious disease expertise into a military space in the United States, was worry about the possibility of a bioterrorist attack in the wake of the Cold War. Biodefense planners in the United States became especially concerned about missing stockpiles of Soviet biological weapons, anthrax, smallpox. Novelists and journalists wrote best-selling books about this in the 1990s. President Bill Clinton became especially worried that we as a country were quite vulnerable to a bioterrorist attack, and scenarios and simulations were developed to model what would unfold if such an attack took place within an immunologically naive population in the United States, and smallpox vaccination had ceased. A famous scenario-based exercise in 2001 called Dark Winter enacted such a bioterrorist attack, and it found, as these scenarios tend to, that there was a catastrophic result. There was not only major unmanageable chains of infection, but social disruption, political chaos resulted. And a number of vulnerabilities were found, one of which was that that first responders, emergency responders, needed to be vaccinated in advance of such an attack. And so during the Bush administration in the US, a major program was rolled out, in fact, to vaccinate all emergency responders against smallpox. And our national stockpile was supplied with hundreds of millions of doses of smallpox vaccine. And I mentioned that story in part to say that, in the United States, we were arguably the first country to become prepared for a biological disaster, but we were prepared for a very different kind of biological disaster than what eventually struck, and that preparedness continually surprises planners, and as much as they seek to prepare for a specific kind of event, it turns out that another event occurs instead. And that's something I'll want to return to, hopefully, in our conversation, which is one of the limits of preparedness. Now, in the early 2000s, after SARS in 2002, and the reemergence of avian influenza in 2004 and 5, in some ways, these two strands, infectious disease epidemiology and virology on the one hand, and bioterrorism, security preparedness on the other, came together in a form of global pandemic preparedness. And I would date that roughly to 2005 with the agreement forged by the World Health Organization on a revised version of the international health regulations. Mara alluded to this in her opening remarks. The agreement that on the definition of a new kind of entity, which is the public health emergency of international concern, developed really to encourage nation states, members of the World Health Organization, to report as soon as possible any outbreak of an event that could potentially cause global catastrophe, a biological event, whether a terrorist attack or the outbreak of a new pathogen. So these international health regulations were agreed upon by the member states of the World Health Organization under the aegis of a strategy called global public health security. And the strategy involved putting in place techniques for the early detection, transparent communication, and rapid response to any potentially catastrophic outbreak. The role of the World Health Organization here was not an operational one. As many have remarked, it's a small coordinative body, but rather to provide technical guidance and to encourage collaboration and coordination among its member nations. One of the things that was part of this strategy was to try to encourage each nation to develop its own pandemic preparedness plan. And the idea being that when an event, a public health emergency of international concern, was declared, each nation would put into action its preparedness plan. Now, over the following decade, from 2005 on, a series of events really put this system to the test. And we can name a couple of them here just briefly. The 2009 swine flu. Most of you will remember when it initially appeared in the spring of 2009, global health authorities were worried that it was actually very much the kind of event that they had been preparing for, something akin to avian influenza, a very severe type of influenza to which the global population was not, had no immunity. The World Health Organization rapidly declared a global health emergency, and the wealthy nations of the world put into place their preparedness plans, including mass vaccination campaigns. And something unexpected happened, of course, which is that as knowledge was produced about the characteristics of the virus over the following several months, over the course of the summer of 2009, it turned out that what's called the case fatality rate, the virulence of the virus, was relatively mild. Of course, it did kill tens of thousands of people, but not nearly as severe as had initially been feared. There were reported side effects from the vaccine, and many countries, especially in Europe, the populations were quite skeptical of even taking the vaccine by the time it was ready in the fall of 2009. And so countries had spent hundreds of millions of dollars, of euros, on this vaccination campaign, which had no takers. Interestingly, critics then accused the World Health Organization of having raised the warning flags too early, of having overreacted, and perhaps even of having been complicit with the global pharmaceutical industry in trying to produce profits for vaccine production. So the World Health Organization was very defensive, became perhaps a bit more wary about declaring an emergency at the outset of an event when the contours of a novel disease are still rather uncertain. Several years later, in 2014, we had the next global health emergency officially declared. And this one, the World Health Organization was again heavily criticized. This was the Ebola epidemic in West Africa. But this time the global health experts were criticized not for having declared an emergency too early, but for having waited too long to declare an emergency. The epidemic began in the late spring of 2014, and by the time WHO officially declared an emergency in August of 2014, it was already a catastrophic regional outbreak and beginning to threaten to become global, which is actually what provoked the declaration of the emergency. And so WHO was again widely criticized. And in this case, a number of reforms were proposed. One of the reforms was to try to equip countries around the world, especially poorer countries, with the kinds of preparedness capacities that had been developed in the wealthy world over the prior couple of decades. And these are tools for early detection and response, emergency communication systems, forms of monitoring disease emergence and spread. And in the United States, the Obama administration actually put a group together in the National Security Council that was attentive to the emergence of global outbreaks. And the idea being that one of the failures in Ebola had been that national security officials had not been paying much attention to the security dimensions of an outbreak that might take place in the global South. So significant efforts were made over the last 2 years of the Obama administration to put in place expertise and capabilities, not only in the United States, but globally. And one of the outcomes, interestingly, of this was the development of metrics to gauge just how prepared any country in the world was for the possibility of a catastrophic disease outbreak. I'm going to return to that point in a moment. Now, the last event we might remark on before getting to the present is the Zika outbreak of 2016, which was also very quickly declared a global health emergency. But the impetus and the resources to learn about it and try to control it could not be sustained. The World Health Organization is fairly limited in its capacities and tries to do a lot of different kinds of things, not just manage emergencies, but it has lots of programs involving non-communicable diseases or vaccination against much longer standing scourges like polio. And so part of what was discovered with Zika was that ongoing preparedness requires sustained investment that must span periods beyond the outset of catastrophic events. And one thing that we, of course, have found in the last couple of years is that the efforts of governments to prepare, and we see that that the book tracks over the last 2.5 decades, seem not to have actually helped a lot, at least in the United States. All of this work to be prepared has landed us in a situation in which, in the United States, among wealthy nations, we've arguably had one of the poorest responses. And I'm sometimes asked, well, as I said at the beginning, why weren't we prepared for this coronavirus? Why we? By we, I mean in the United States. And here, as many of you have probably read, we've had a really chaotic, disorganized, belated, and still very, very poorly run federal response to the pandemic, and we're really arguably still in a situation of fragmentary, uncoordinated, and arguably chaotic response to it. So let me mention a kind of irony that came out of these efforts in the around 2016 to measure the level of health preparedness of countries around the world. And an index was generated by a couple of US-based think tanks that's called the Global Health Security Index. And it measured the preparedness level of 195 countries around the world for the possibility of a catastrophic disease outbreak. And what were the response capabilities? What were the surveillance capabilities? The detection, the stockpiling, the plans for the distribution of supplies, and so on. The country that was named in this index as the most prepared country in the world was the United States. And very interestingly, and Britain was the number 2 country. So 2 of the countries that have had, I would argue, among the poorest responses in the industrialized West were the top-ranked countries. And some of the countries that we might say have done relatively well in COVID-19, Germany was ranked number 9. South Korea, I think, number 14, Singapore, number 24. So they were down the list. And I think this poses the question of whether these efforts to prepare were actually engaged in the right sort of measures and whether what was the problem that in the United States we were preparing for the wrong thing, or perhaps preparedness wasn't the right question. So let me make a couple of hypotheses about this seeming paradox that the place that is arguably the global capital of health preparedness has found itself in a situation of seeming disorganization and even chaos in response to coronavirus. One is that the suggestion that preparing for a future outbreak was actually focused on some of the wrong things. Focused on stockpiling of supplies. It was focused on rapid production of biomedical countermeasures. But that what we found is actually very basic issues like the condition of the health system, the availability of extra hospital beds, the level of income inequality in the population actually have much more effects on the ability of a country to respond well. Issues like trust in government, the role of authoritative experts in defining governmental guidelines for response. So perhaps we were we were not preparing with the right tools. Perhaps we were preparing for the wrong events. I mentioned preparation for a smallpox pandemic, or another event that we spent a lot of time preparing for was bird flu. And so we have stockpiles of antiviral medications that are not effective against COVID-19. But I would say probably most markedly, it seems to me that preparedness per se may be the wrong question. You may have good plans in place, and in fact, in the United States, we did have pretty sophisticated plans for the use of non-pharmaceutical interventions to flatten the epidemiological curve while increasing hospital surge capacity and so forth. You might have these good plans in place, but if the major players in government are not interested in those plans, don't practice those plans, aren't even aware of those plans as we have now, or don't care about them, those existing plans will not do you any good. And so it turns out that a country's political situation and governmental situation is going to have a much larger impact than the planning per se. And we in the United States, of course, have entered into a radically transformed political situation in the last 3 years that has deeply undermined the ability of the country to adequately deal with this event. So let me close my remarks there with, again, an openness and interest in conversation and questions from all of you, and perspectives on what what the situation looks like in each of your areas where you're based. And thank you again, Mara, and your team.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks for raising such important issues and sharing your arguments. Just a single question, and then I will leave the floor to the others and to Lorenzo. As you say, the coronavirus pandemic, also in Europe, not only in the United States, has involved different stakeholders and the world of experts, let's say at large, in a broader debate about the complex relationship between the sphere of risk on one side and the sphere of temporality on the other side. The following questions are indeed on the public agenda, especially in these last days. How much do we risk in the course of this pandemic, for instance? Where and who is most at risk due to the virus? Is the contagion itself the greatest risk, or the loss of earnings is even worse? And also, which place in our risk perception and assessment do we associate to the following criteria: biosecurity, social protection, financial stability, health equity, and so on? And above all, how can we prioritize these different factors? How do people relate to their future consequently? I was wondering if in circumstances of extreme uncertainty, it's even more difficult to act on pre-given futures. I think that the preferred approach then is what I refer to as futures in the making. If pre-given futures are clearly linked to the past, linked with the history of socio-cultural relationships in a given context, the latter instead, the futures in the making, is difficult to grasp in that it eludes past temporalities. This kind of future on the way has yet to surface and become visible. And in these days, indeed, we are witnessing a huge proliferation of theories on what can help us make the near future present, to anticipate the phases to come, to anticipate our degrees of freedom and restrictions, our plans for containment of the virus, and the potential period of re-explosion of the infection with consequential public measures. This enormous effort of anticipation is not a neutral process. It distributes unequally the capabilities required by actors in order to influence their future. Thus, the question is not only what life is to be protected or saved, but whom and with what effect in the future. But the question is also what life will be abandoned or destroyed in the chain of events connecting our present with the future. What is the role assumed by the current pandemic then in redefining a global risk map and in forging the politics, the chronopolitics related to our futures in the making? This is my question, my probably main question. And Andrew, you can start probably to answering this question, and then Lorenzo Dorsi will moderate the discussion, regulating the turns to speak. Let's just remember that if you all want to ask a question or make a comment, you can write a private message to Lorenzo Dorsi in this room through the chat facility, the chat box, and he will call you when it is your turn to speak. Please unmute your microphone and turn your video off until you have the floor. Thank you. Andrew.
Yeah, Mara, I think you've articulated an agenda for an anthropology of the present as it unfolds, because this question of, as you put it, risk versus uncertainty, the future in the making is something that is the stakes are incredibly high politically now and scientifically. Let me open with a few thoughts, but I think that's the conversation that will continue over the course of the next hour, I hope, because I think I don't have a definitive answer, and I think it's a really rich and difficult set of questions you've raised. Just from the perspective of my own research, the way that I tend to frame this question is via a longstanding debate over how to plan for future threats between risk assessment techniques that assume that you can actually map the effects of a given action on the future based on knowledge of the past, and that you can make a cost-benefit analysis of which action is the most rational given that knowledge, versus a precautionary logic that says that we're facing such an uncertain and potentially catastrophic future that we actually need to work intensely on mitigating our vulnerabilities and lessening our risk to the greatest extent possible. It seems pretty clear that the initial policies of lockdown around the world were based on a precautionary logic. That is, this is a catastrophic event. We can't let it continue to unfold. We cannot actually try at this stage to balance economic benefits against public health, or economic losses against public health benefits. What we're in the midst of now, I would suggest, is an attempt by many to shift from a state of uncertainty to a state of risk. That is, to generate enough knowledge, both about the effects of the virus, but also about the economic effects of these shutdowns and other social distancing measures, so that we can make some kind of rational technocratic assessment of what sort of measures we're willing to take. Now, the problem, of course, is that we're still too early in terms of our knowledge of the virus to be able to really do an adequate technocratic cost-benefit analysis. And what you find, certainly in the United States, is what I would call a pseudo debate between opening up the economy versus maintaining social distancing. And it's a pseudo debate because there's no pretense to knowledge of what the public health effects would be of reopening the economy. And indeed, what we see happening is that people who are fairly privileged are arguing, essential workers need to go back to work. And of course, the essential workers are people who are delivering food, who are working as nurses in hospitals, who don't have the privilege of working from home and not making themselves vulnerable. So people who are most vulnerable, it seems, are likely to be the people that are most put at risk initially, as we make sure to quote reopen the economy. So the political stakes of making this future as the present unfolds are obviously quite high. So thank you for that. Thank you for that question.
Thank you, Andrew. Okay, I also have a question, but I will keep it for later because we already have 5 questions. I will start with Luca Rimoldi. Luca, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you, Andrew, for your presentation. Mine just a general question. So many scholars claim that in the near future, pandemic could become a recurring phenomenon in our everyday life. So I was wondering, do you think that social sciences and anthropology in particular could play a public role in dealing with these scenarios, these pandemic scenarios? And if so, what kind of public role? Thank you.
Should I address questions, or do you want to take a few? How would you?
As you wish, Andrew. As you prefer.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. I'm going to again be reticent in the role of forecaster of whether this is a unique event or will be a recurring event. It's one of the things that I observed in my research on this field in studying the experts is that there's prophecies. There are a number of areas in which you have what we might call prophets of doom, who have been arguing for decades that we were overdue for a pandemic. Now they're now being treated as having been correct. Whether it's in fact the case that we will see many more such events, I don't know, but I would just argue that there are other fields of disaster specialists, people looking at terrorism or of course climate change, who are also telling us that we need to be prepared for other kinds of disasters. I think the role of social science probably is to try to address some of the questions that Mara was just posing around, what a much more holistic form of resilience against a range of possible crises looks like, and what kinds of economic, political, and social interventions would assuage the vulnerabilities that have been exposed by this event. So I think there's clearly a really critical role for social science, and one might say that the preparedness expertise that was developed, at least in the United States over the last 2 decades, was much too biomedically focused. That is, that the preparedness experts were not really capable of thinking about the social and economic consequences of the event itself, as well as of the responses to the event, and that those thinking deeply and sophisticatedly about the social dimensions of the crisis was not part of the preparedness planning process. So I think there is a very intriguing role for social scientists going forward.
Thank you, Andrew. So now the floor is to Sankalpa Guha. I hope that I pronounced the name correctly. Sankalpa, are you there?
Hi, this is Sankalpa. Yeah, sir, you pronounced my name correctly. My question is, do you think this anticipation you're talking about might change into a distrust or paranoia of sorts post this pandemic, owing to the number of fatalities all over the world? Moreover, how do you think people's idea of pandemic would change after the situation dissolves?
Well, so there's 2 questions there. One about paranoia, and that's and the other about a changing conception of pandemic. I guess one thing to attend to, of course, is that this question of how pandemics end and what they turn into, how we return, or if we return to a state of normalcy, and that's both a biomedical question, but again a social question. We could say biomedically, gradually, historically, with pandemics, over a couple of years, populations attain at least significant immunity. The severity of the disease declines. One thing one might suggest, and this is something that Friedrich Keck has written about, is that societies will have to learn to live with the virus, and live with our relation to emerging viruses more without the kinds of intensive and as you suggested, almost paranoid responses to the possibility of an emerging disease. I think that the attitudes towards pandemics, one way that they're likely to change is that people have a much more visceral and real sense of, at least in the present, of what it feels like to have this experience collectively. We hear repeatedly, we've never seen this before. We couldn't have expected this. And of course, it is not a part of living memory to have this kind of global event, but it will become a part of living memory for the next couple of generations at least. So presumably in the same way that the memory of total war shaped political, social, and military action over the second half of the 20th century, it's possible that the memory of this pandemic will shape action going forward over the next several decades.
Thank you, Sankalpa. Thank you, Andrew. Now I give the floor to Massimo Tomasoli. Massimo, are you there?
Thank you very much, Lorenzo. And I'm based actually in the US, Andrew. I represent an organization that deals with democracy. So my interest in the relationship between democratic processes and the response to the crisis is paramount. And I look also at how the UN is dealing with that. I have a comment and the question. The comment is that what you reconstructed as the origin of the concept of preparedness, moving on from all the way from nuclear attacks to pandemic, is rather similar to what happened in the field of aid, because the military jargon has really shaped the planning techniques, and you can see that also in the language that is used which is really drawn from military reasoning. For example, target groups, goals and objectives, and a lot of that permeates planning also in the field of humanitarian aid. I have noticed, and that is the question, I've noticed in the case of public debates and expertise used by policymakers, a clear absence of social scientists in Italy. There is a plethora of task forces established by the government, and very few are social scientists. As far as I know, there is no anthropologist advising the government on the response, and even less so on the recovery phase. And to tell the truth, I noticed the same also in the US. What you see are experts in the field of public health, epidemiologists, virologists, immunologists, but very, very few voices from social sciences. And I've also no memory of an anthropologist engaged in this conversation in public debates. And still, the statistics that these experts from epidemiology, for example, use are highly questionable. A lot of the decisions that were taken by decision makers were based on statistics that were more guesswork than actual statistics, because they were based on the number of infected people and many say that the infected people were many more than those identified through tests and so forth. The concept of deaths. People died with or for because of coronavirus gave very, very different numbers. So why do you share this view, and why do you think it is happening?
Well, thank you for the question. I would agree with you that there's not very many social scientists at the table of high-level decision makers. I will say that the one social science that's pretty well represented in the debates over response is economics, which is, of course, the dominant in the United States, at least the dominant policy social science. One might argue that the economics form of knowledge is more easily instrumentalizable than anthropologists' form of knowledge. It's obviously a much more powerful discipline culturally as well as institutionally. But certainly in the fields that many of us are a part of, interpretive sociology and cultural anthropology are pretty much invisible in terms of discussions of the response. On your question about statistics and the role of epidemiological statistics in making decisions, I think it's a fascinating one. It actually, to me, goes back to Mara's question about how we anticipate the future based on knowledge we have of the present. What sort of knowledge do we have about the present that can be an anchor for making policy decisions with very great consequences about the future? The fascinating story about the first several weeks or even couple of months of the pandemic in the United States and I think elsewhere was the use of epidemiological models. So not statistics, because we didn't have knowledge about the transmission rate. We didn't have knowledge about the level of virulence. We didn't have knowledge about the number of cases that already, or of infections that already existed in the United States. And so we had very generalized models that were continually being updated and contested. And there were different models in contest with one another. And now there's an attempt by epidemiologists to build in what the epidemiological consequences would be of given social and economic policies. But we're still operating in something of a fog of uncertainty. We're still operating in this situation in which, and this varies by country. Of course, you have countries that have done a much, much better job than the United States of instituting widespread testing, tracking, isolating. But here, at least, we are still grappling with the question of what percentage of the population has been exposed to the virus. No one knows. What is the actual infection fatality rate? Is it 0.1%? Is it 1%? We don't know. So this is why I said, arguably, we're in this murky situation between uncertainty and risk, between having to try to act in a precautionary way, whatever we mean by that, versus making claims based on knowledge of the recent past about what the future will hold. So this is a moment for I think a critical social science of the production of knowledge about disease, to understand precisely what you asked, which is how do we make policy decisions given these uncertainties around what's actually unfolding.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for your reply. Now I give the floor to Anna Beichel-Brown. Sorry for the pronunciation.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Thank you so much for this amazing event. I'm learning a lot. Because, Andrew, you mentioned sort of the role of trust in producing a good or an effective public health response. I'm just wondering, what do you think is necessary for that trust? I've been thinking about trust a lot lately too, and I'm sort of dissatisfied with the squishiness of that term. And I'm just wondering, do you know of any, or do you have any compelling anthropological theories of trust? And what do you think are the elements that produce trust in a government, in a population? Is it communication? Is it about knowledge? Is it about I don't know, something else even squishier than that?
Yeah, that's a very, very apt question. If I can, I actually want to make a request, and I will begin with you, Anna. I had forgotten to make this request earlier. When I if people wouldn't mind introducing themselves a little bit, just where you are and what field you're in, just so that I have a sense of who's there. So I'll put you on the spot to begin, Anna, and then
Sure.
Others to do that as well.
So I'm an anthropologist, cultural linguistic. I'm in Vienna right now at the University of Vienna. I'm a graduate of the University of Chicago and work with Joe Masco there. So I've been thinking about Cold War and emergency preparedness, and wrote my dissertation on the International Atomic Energy Agency, which governs nuclear technologies and governs risk in a sense as well.
Great. Well, I'm going to slightly dodge your question because, of course, there's a wonderful social science research generally on the centrality of trust to social organizations, and there's very nice research on the role of trust in the capacity of scientific authority to attain credibility. And classically, we could think of Stephen Shapin's work, just for example, on the significance in the early modern period of trust. As a counter argument to a philosophy of science that assumes that that it's empirical discovery or hypothesis, the use of the scientific method that on its own produces credibility for scientific truth claims, but really it's a social phenomenon of trust and trustworthiness. And so I think you can certainly make the case that we're suffering from some kind of crisis of trust and expertise. At least in the United States, obviously around climate change and vaccination, but you're seeing it, this incredible politicization of scientific claims where you have somebody who for many years has been the officially trusted infectious disease expert of the US government, and Anthony Fauci, who's now targeted the site of conspiracy theories and claims that he's part of a plot to actually have induced the pandemic in order to generate profits for vaccine manufacturers. So we're in an amazing moment in which, in the midst of a public health crisis, we're also suffering from a crisis of trust. I said I was going to dodge the question. I think by retreating into being somebody who studies expertise. So I'll just mention this field that I think is pretty interesting of risk communication, which studies how authorized experts should go about sustaining public trust in their claims in the middle of a crisis. So risk communication specialists will say things like, the political folks should step back and the experts should step forward and provide guidelines. Or, what you need to do is emphasize the level of uncertainty that you have, or give the public things to do. And interestingly, during the H1N1 pandemic of 2009, you could really see the Obama administration instituting these risk communication specialist guidelines. So the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control leaders, were the ones who actually led the public events, the public press conferences around the disease. The only thing that the political authorities like President Obama would do would be to say, we have to listen to our scientists. We don't have all the relevant information yet. You as members of the public can do things like wash your hands. So this was really the playbook of the field of risk communication. Now you'll note that the Trump, those of you who are paying attention to things in the United States, at least, the Trump administration has no idea of this playbook, and in fact, the politician is the person who's holding forth. He has subdued his experts, and he's made all sorts of claims about what's going on that have proven untrue. So he's basically violating every single principle of how you would sustain trust in expertise during a crisis.
Thank you, Andrew. Somehow you already replied to my hypothetical question. Now I give the word to Roberta Raffeta. Roberta, are you there?
I'm here. Okay, thanks and thanks to Mara and the organizers, and thank you, Andrew, for your remarkable work and your talk. So I am an anthropologist, sociocultural anthropologist, and I work at Bolzano University, which is north part of Italy, at the border, almost at the border with Austria. And in my last 6 years, I have done an ethnography in lab where scientists study microbes to observe how they produce this kind of knowledge and how this knowledge impact on how we conceive the microbial world. And I have done ethnography mostly in Italian lab, but also I have done some field work in California because I was at UCL at the institute led by Hannah Landecker. And I would have a question for you. So you have nicely illustrated the legacy of the global health of preparedness, this military legacy in the US, this strong military legacy. And I do not know much, but I can figure out that also in Europe there is kind of this legacy. But maybe, probably, I don't know, and this is my question to you, if you know about that in a comparative lens, if this may be weaker military legacy of global health of preparedness in Europe might give an opening to a different and future understanding of how to prepare or to live with future epidemics. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question, and of course would be interested to hear from other European colleagues their take on this. You know, the one instinct I have on this, based on the research that I did on the 2009 response to swine flu in Europe versus the United States, is that I think your instinct is right, that the legacy is much less strong of a kind of acceptance of the norm of this form of anticipatory mobilization on a military model. That is, in the United States, I think it was a kind of taken for granted norm, even if it didn't always succeed. It wasn't necessarily questioned. What we saw in Europe in 2009 was that from the world of public health prevention, there was tremendous skepticism of the idea of preparedness, and it was seen really as a diversion of resources from what were the real problems of ongoing everyday health needs of the collective. And just to address, I think that might be something that will turn out to be one source of insight into why a place like Germany has had a much more resilient response to this disease than the United States has, arguably because of more investment in the health system and the capacities of hospitals, and the confidence of the public in the health system. So preparedness actually did not necessarily work on the resilience of a broad public health and medical system in the way that countries with a stronger social welfare system than the US took for granted. So that could be at least one effect of this, which would be to realize that these two problems are really interconnected. You can't have preparedness without also having a very serious investment in your health system. Although, of course, there are stories in Europe of places that have invested in their health system over decades, but then nonetheless had a very problematic response to COVID-19. So it's not easy to generalize.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you a lot. Now I give the word to Silvia Vignato. Silvia, are you there?
Yes, do you see me?
Yes.
Okay. So mine is a very limited question. I'm an cultural and social anthropologist, and I work in the University of Milano Bicocca in Milan. So we have lived this pandemics from the heart of the peak of the highest level of infection in Italy. And one thing which has been remarkable, but which is flooding the general communication about pandemic, concerns the representation of entitlement to live, the span of life. Basically, there's, after the lockdown where everything was suspended and where the dominant view was death, so there were all these coffins with all these military echoes in it. But then now the question has shifted to how long one is entitled to live, and is it part of preparedness to prepare to live a shorter life, and who is entitled to be saved, and do the young people, should the young people give up it's not only their economics, but their view, giving place for the oldest one. So it's a representation of the entitlement to live. It is very critical also for the discourse about generational conflict. We just waited for something new to find its foundation in Italy now. So now suddenly it's we don't want to give up our lives for you to live, and all this kind of speech. So how does it influence a state of preparedness, the idea that you're entitled to live a longer or shorter, or this has been in Europe, or in Italy in particular, but in all of Europe, there was this raise of this astonishment when some of the states in the US declared that in case of choice, even mentally handicapped people would be the second best choice to be revived, resuscitated in intensive care. So how does it, or what role does it play into preparedness, this representation of entitlement to life? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, you're raising again the question I think that Mara posed about the value of different lives in the midst of this kind of crisis as we try to make decisions about the future. This also, I think, very importantly points to the distinctiveness of coronavirus. The distinctive epidemiological profile of the disease, in which the elderly are more vulnerable or more at risk. And then this question you raised, that has been raised in the US explicitly, maybe implicitly elsewhere, around how much resources should be devoted to extending the life of someone who has already lived, is posed very much around the particularities of this virus. And so one thing about preparedness, of course, is it couldn't have predicted a virus like this, or it didn't predict a virus like this with a variegated epidemiological profile in which certain people are more vulnerable than others. And in fact, I would say preparedness doesn't have a very differentiated understanding of the value of different kinds of lives. It really focuses on infrastructures for sustaining populations in general, but it doesn't focus either on individual lives or even really on subpopulations as a form of rationality. And so these are questions, the questions you're posing are not questions that preparedness as a form of rationality was able to pose itself. And I don't know whether it can pose them. But indeed, they are being asked, and you have this quite shocking events in the United States where the lieutenant governor of Texas said, I'm a senior citizen. I will give my life. I will expose myself to risk so that the young can have their economic life not destroyed. So again, a sort of imputed cost-benefit analysis without the actual capacity to make the technical calculations are being made around relative values of different lives. The other place where this conversation took place, and interestingly, Europe was seen as and Spain and Italy in particular, as a kind of countervailing model, was this issue around triage in the hospital, and did protocols need to be developed for who would get scarce supplies? This is a wartime model, of course, triage. If there's a certain number of supplies, how are we going to prioritize whose life is going to matter? And indeed, those kinds of calculus. I didn't know the one about people with disabilities, but certainly about who's most likely to be able to live an extended life. Those people should get the scarce supplies, was the discourse in the crisis situation in New York, for example. So I think this is again the kind of question that we as anthropologists can ask and have the tools to observe what's unfolding in different places around how lives are being valued. So thank you for that question.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Silvia. Now I give the floor to Ignatius Trabacar. Ignatius, are you there? Ignatius? So maybe we lost Ignatius. So I give the floor to Francesco Vacchiano. Francesco.
Yes, please, I'm here. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Lorenzo. Thank you, Andrew, for your very interesting presentation. Very quick questions and reflections. It seems to me that the case you presented in concerning the US shows that plans for preparedness and emergency, seems not work very well when they equate viruses with wars somehow. You described a very engineered system of response based on war threats, basically on military, let's say a military interpretation of a possible attack coming from a biosecurity threat. I wonder whether this is a very valid, useful paradigm to think this kind of situations. And my second question is in line with this first reflection. I think that don't you think that's beyond a punctual and specialistic idea of preparedness, built, for example, on stockpiling food and medicine, a better response would have been having a good generalist, universalist system of prevention and intervention, basically a solid, well-organized public health system, funded accordingly. The case of Italy, for example, I think it seems to me quite telling in this sense. Lombardy is the region of Milan, is an area where the model that has been implemented across the last years is very much focused on specialistic responses, hospitals, agreement with private facilities, and basically on the detriment of an organizational model based on territorial services, proximity, intervention, nearness, and close to people. So, specialism on the one hand is the dominant paradigm, while probably we could think preparedness. I don't know what you think about it. Preparedness like a systemic fact, not just a specialistic and even less military endeavor, but more like a generalist, universalistic, and systemic form of thinking the problem of social reproduction under a pandemic.
And would you mind introducing yourself just so that I...
Sorry, yes, I'm Francesco Vacchiano. I'm a psychologist and an anthropologist, and I work at University Ca' Foscari in Venice.
Okay, yeah. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you for your intervention. Well, I agree with everything you said to start with. Let me add one observation, which is about the different ways that war can be, that war as a model can be transposed onto disease. And one that's commonly remarked upon are metaphors of war. And so there's a lot of work that has been done on notions of invaders, containment, the language and the images of war that get adopted to treat infectious disease. In a way, I'm not arguing that, although of course you see that today. What I'm more interested in is a different way that war has affected how we think about and anticipate emergencies, which is the domain of national mobilization, and that that when you have a situation where there's an existential threat to the continuity of the polity, some form of collective transformation is necessary in order to endure this event. And in the United States, a technocratic model of mobilization was developed in the mid-20th century that has proven, I will say, useful, not because it's successful, but because it has continued to reproduce itself over the decades since the mid-20th century. And that, I think, has also had some successes in that, there are ways that coordinative action among very heterogeneous jurisdictions in the United States, states, localities, the federal government can actually be successful and important in addressing national or regional crisis events. And there are examples when it has been successful. So I don't want to completely push aside the notion that technical models developed out of war preparation could be applied to other domains. Part of what's happened here is that that requires a lot of sophisticated experts and authorities who know how to put those plans into action and to actually engage with other jurisdictions, other forms of expertise. And we haven't had that capacity here this time. But in terms of your question around a more universal or holistic form of resilience versus something that is very specifically designed for specific kinds of pathogens, I think you're absolutely right that we still have in our stockpiles, as I suggested, millions of smallpox vaccine. And it takes a lot of money to keep there's cold storage. There's all of the different warehouses around the country where people have to maintain this and they have to reorder it when it expires. Tremendous billions and billions of dollars spent on a disease that didn't happen. So if you're going to spend that kind of money, as you suggest, spend it on every day a strong public health system that will be of use at an everyday level, and also when an event like this occurs, whose contours cannot actually be anticipated in detail in advance.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Francesco. Thank you, Andrew. I see that Ignazio is joining us again. Ignazio, are you there? You lost your time, but I can give you the floor now for your question. Ignatius? No, probably he has some problem of connection, because I see that he asked me twice to get in. So I give the floor to Enrico Milazzo, and then I will keep the time for a question for me.
Hello, thank you, Lorenzo and Mara and Andrew Lakoff. It's very interesting. I'm Enrico. I'm a PhD student at the same university as Professor Bacchiano in Ca' Foscari, Venice, and Padua. And I've been working with a collective, Collettivo Epidemia, that's our name, on the epidemic of Xylella fastidiosa, which is a pathogen of olive trees in South Apulia in Italy. And one of the other members, Christian, is here in this interesting seminar. And we were thinking about how this notion of preparedness would relate with ecosystemic relations. That's a thing that I did not really catch. I did not really understand from your words, Andrew. I mean, when, for example, in the case we studied, we had like 60 million olive trees that could be really easily affected because of density, because of their health condition, soil condition, and even if this bacteria was coming from external, from globalization stuff, like we were thinking about systemic causes that would probably let this epidemic spread and make a lot of damages. In the same way, we were thinking about coronavirus. I mean, do we have ecosystemic relations that imply those kinds of events? I refer to Rob Wallace's thesis on zoonosis, on the fact that coronavirus is a symptom of our way to produce meat, to produce food in general, and to farm animals. So a very specific kind of ecosystemic relation, that is the ecosystemic relation of modern capitalism. So this kind of ecosystemic relation is taken for granted in this idea of preparedness, and how does rationality actually respond to this assertion. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, well, you know, I always, following Canguilhem, will want to look at multiple rationalities rather than a single rationality, and agree with you that the rationality of preparedness, if not taken for granted, certainly does not intervene to transform the ecosystemic relations of modern capitalism that generate these vulnerabilities, precisely what you described. So you could have a rationality of prevention. For example, let us say ban bushmeat trade in sub-Saharan Africa, because bushmeat might be a source of a new emerging pathogen. To me, that isn't actually part of how I would circumscribe the concept of preparedness. That's prevention. That's preventive. You could say the same thing about wildlife markets in East Asia. Now, what preparedness does vis-a-vis this ecosystemic relation that you're describing is try to find those sites of emergence and track them and monitor them. And so you have, during the worries about avian influenza, a lot of monitoring of the viral compositions of migratory waterfowl around the world, because they were seen as potential spreaders of this disease. Or you have these systems that have been built to monitor bushmeat markets in Africa and test them for a possible new virus. So you, once that virus happens, you're ready. You can stop it. You can contain it before it becomes the next AIDS. And the same thing with coronavirus. The premise would have been that, early on in this process, in the bat to human, or the bat to intermediary animal to human ecological relationship, we would have had in place monitoring systems that would have sort of tested the emergence of this new virus early enough to contain it. So to me that's a limit. I think your question implies this. It's a limit of preparedness. It doesn't actually act on the deep underlying conditions that cause emergence, but it observes that they exist and says, given that they exist, we're going to have repeated emergence of new diseases. And so what we need to do is contain them quick, period.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Now I have a question for you. From my point of view, let's say the preparedness planned by scientists, medical doctors, bureaucratic actors, does not seem to take those elements of irrationality, such as the spread of conspiracy theories in the population, into account. So it seems to me that these elements of irrationality have become key elements in times when they no longer circulate just in little marginalized groups, but are, for example, used by leading political actors, for example, Donald Trump, but also here in Italy. So do you think that the experts that build the rationality of preparedness have started to take these elements into consideration? And in this respect, I'm also wondering if the understanding and handling of these elements may represent an area where cultural anthropology can offer a specific contribution with respect to other knowledge. Thank you.
Yeah, it's very interesting. We're certainly seeing this discussion in the United States around irrationality, and experts of various kinds, wringing their hands about the crisis of trust and expertise, as we discussed earlier with Anna. I will say that again, that there is a history of reflection on public response and how you should manage public response. That's part of this same history. So during Anna mentioned Joe Masco's work on Cold War affect, Cold War emotional management of the collective around the fear of a nuclear attack. There was a whole field of psychology developed for understanding what causes panic among a population, because panic was seen as something that would undermine an orderly and successful response to an atomic attack. And that this field actually is the basis for the current field of risk communication, which is designed to keep the public calm and to keep the public trusting that the experts know the right answer of what we should do next. So to a certain extent, planners are aware of this problem. And part of the Centers for Disease Control's national preparedness plans involve risk communication. Interestingly, what you just noted is something I think quite apt, which is that it's not just that the current political administration in Washington has ignored this expertise, but in fact, you're noting, I think rightly, that they've taken advantage of irrationality, or what experts would consider irrationality. In other words, they are actively seeking to foster conspiracy theories because it advances certain political goals. And in that, I don't think preparedness experts had anticipated that there would be political authorities at the head of the federal government that would encourage what we would call irrationality. So certainly, anthropological investigations of how we distinguish rationality from irrationality, what brings together groups that hold beliefs that are antithetical to what experts claim, why they hold those beliefs, why they don't trust what experts claim seems critically important. And we do have some good work on that. For example, there's excellent ethnographic work on vaccination skeptics, and kind of why it is that they tend to be distrustful of what experts tell them about the efficacy and safety of vaccines. So I think that that's also a very good role for our kind of social science at this moment.
Thank you for your reply, Andrew. I give the floor to Sandrine Revet. She was here before, but I don't know why I missed her question. Sorry, Sandrine.
Hi, thank you, Lorenzo. Hi, Andrew. Hi, Mara. Thank you very much for this very interesting event. I'm very pleased to be here and to share. Andrew, I present rapidly for the other. We know each other, but I present. I'm an anthropologist in Paris, and I'm specialized in disaster anthropology, we can say. Listen to you. It's an old discussion we have, Andrew. So I come back to that because every time I chuck with this. But this is my first question. When you say that preparedness develop or is based on imaginative practices and imaginative enactment. For what I've been seeing in the natural disaster world of expertise and professional is a total lack of imagination. It's the incapacity of imagination. When you observe drills, you see first that the scenario are very politically constrained by all the actors in order not to be in bad condition, and the incapacity of people that rehearse, at least the one I have seen, to imagine unprecedented situation, and they don't want to, be luck in a situation when they are going to be unprepared. So for me, preparedness is the contrary of imagination. It's repetition of it. So it's almost the logic of prevention, but with the discourse of imagination. So this is the first point, and this goes in. It leads me to a concrete question about the formation of these people, of this elite. And I think we are all concerned with this because we sometimes participate in this formation of these people. At least in Sciences Po in Paris, I definitively do participate in the formation of the elite, of the managers of France, and how our system, university system, possibilitate the possibility of imagination, or do we have a role to play in this, and how anthropology can be a tool to introduce this possibility of imagination. This is my first question. The second question is about, I am struck when I was listening to you and Mara's question about, the importance of temporality. Preparedness is a very short time frame. It's based on emergency, and it talks about a crisis, a peak, and attending the crisis. And we all have read, and we know from this crisis and from the others, that what really matters, would be long-term policies, almost displaced from the hazard, and policies that would reduce vulnerability, but not vulnerability in the way related to this specific hazard, but vulnerability of the society in general. So holistic policies, and this is what anthropology of disaster has called root causes for decades. So how come, and this is another question for ourselves, anthropologists, how come the discourse of social sciences and anthropology is impossible to be heard? Because we have libraries full of work saying that long-term is a long-term policy, prevention, construction of a good system is the only solution. So there are two big questions, but thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. And well, it's nice to see you. Thank you for joining us. And I'm sorry to force you to keep asking the same question, but I agree with you. So first, on this question of imagination, I mean, I certainly there is a routinization of the scenario such that it isn't actually involve what you mean by imagination, which is trying to really put oneself into a completely unprecedented situation, but that rather a drill means, do this that's in my briefing book, that the planners have already figured out the problem, and so maybe a better word is enactment, as a contrast to a form of actuarial or statistical knowledge, a form of knowledge that has to do with some form of acting out what could occur, and that's the kind of distinction that I want. There's some step we can call imagination, but I agree that it's not the sort of holistic and rich type of imagining that you were describing. On the question of temporality, and I think this is related. I mean, maybe we can say that preparedness offers a fairly narrow toolkit for making a claim that one has adequately anticipated a range of events, and then you're done. You have done your exercise, or you have put together your handbook. That it doesn't take a lot of resources to do that, and even if you stockpile some supplies, that's not the same as massively transforming your health system or reducing the kinds of income inequalities that are going to lead to certain members of the population being especially vulnerable. Now that's politically tough. That requires a significant transformation of your economics and your politics. Whereas preparedness, we can say, it offers a kind of cure that, or I wouldn't say a cure, but a way of addressing this threat that doesn't require the kind of imagination and transformation that you're describing. And maybe that's why it's so popular. I mean, it's that almost no one ever disagrees with the idea that we should be prepared. It's easy to disagree with the idea of universal health care in the United States. It's harder to disagree that we should be prepared for a pandemic. So I think your critique is very apt. So that's all. Yeah, I agree.
Okay, thank you, Sandrine, for such a challenging question, and thank you, Andrew, for your answer. We have the last two questions from Cedric Keck and from Mara for concluding our speaker corner. Cedric, are you there?
Yes.
Thank you.
Can I switch on the video?
Yes, please.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to work. But so I'm not Joël Soler. I'm Frederick Keck. Joël is my wife, as Andy knows. I was interested by the discussion Andy had about the social, which is of course one of the major points of friction between Europe and the US to think about preparedness. And the answer Andy gave was basically that preparedness doesn't take the social into account, which means that preparedness doesn't make social distinctions between humans, because basically that's what prevention has done for the last 2 centuries, which is to calculate risk and anticipate the future based on the social distribution of risk, right? But then on the other hand, I was interested by your reply to, I think, Enrico on the olive tree disease, because diseases concerning plants are also not the major concern of preparedness, right? Because plants don't send diseases to humans. They only die because there are emerging diseases coming from globalization, but it's not a major threat to humans, right? So the question I want to ask to Andy is how far do you think that the main distinction for preparedness as a rationality is between humans and animals? And I tend to agree, but I also resist to the idea of Christos Linteris that pandemics work as a major anthropological grid, to think of human extinction by a kind of symmetrical image of non-human extinction. So you think about, for example, the death of birds or the death of bats, by reversing it into the death of the human species. And so that's where the notion of war is so important, because basically it's the idea that the humans are at war with other species. It's a fight between species for the occupation of the globe in some way, in which microbes play a major role in distributing precisely the chances of occupying the planet, because the planet has become a space of competition, right, to occupy the living space, which is a very strange idea. It's very Darwinian, but the preparedness also relies on very Darwinian models of competition between species. So I would like to hear you on that.
I think that I agree that preparedness is very focused on humans, but animals are of course critical because they're sources of pathogenicity. Let me just, without answering at length, note this very interesting one interesting side effect of this event, which is this capacity to imagine the world without humans. And you've probably seen the videos of Paris with the boars coming through, and I guess it's cities with penguins and kangaroos going through them. And so there was actually a book written maybe a decade ago called The World Without Us, that was an exercise in imagining what would become of the world without humans. And there is a kind of, I won't call it a nostalgia, let's say an anticipatory fantasy of nature as proliferating without humans, as in the zone of abandonment around Chernobyl that we're seeing now. So it's a different side of this that isn't exactly your question, but I think worth reflecting on what pandemics mean for nature-human relations.
Yeah, and then this goes with your idea that preparedness is a transfer from nuclear disaster to global health, because precisely a nuclear disaster is thinking about the end of humanity, but it's the end of humanity through humans, right?
Right.
And pandemics is the end of humanity through other species. So the idea of revenge of nature against humanity, which is a scenario, of course. It's
yeah. Well, zoonotic pandemics, but of course, you could imagine bioengineered pathogens that are more like the scenario of a human-caused extinction event.
That's right. Thanks. I have to go, but thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you, Frederick. Thank you, Andrew. So I give the floor to Mara for a concluding remark. Mara, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you to Andrew. Thank you to us all for this fascinating discussion. It's time to close this meeting. Let's just recalling that the webinar has been recorded and will be available as the first meeting on the SIAA YouTube page and on our Facebook page in a couple of days or so. And Lorenzo will show you the links to use.
Now I share with you wait a second, that I share the screen so that you can find.
Yeah, you can find the links, because I know that it's good to have these meetings available also after the screening. So you will find there the first speaker corner and the second one. And the next webinar is planned for June 8th. And at 5 o'clock local time in Italy. And our speaker will be Sandrine Revet, that is here with us. So we have the 3 speakers here in the meeting. And thanks again. See you soon. And thanks to Andrew and to all. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was wonderful. Thank you.